先生の裁量が子どもを幸せにする学校、ハイテクハイの PBL 実践とはと題してのパネルディスカッションでございます。皆さん楽しみにされてましたよね。では先生方をお迎えしたいと思います。ジョン・サントス先生、そしてジャメル・ジョーンズ先生です。Mr. John Santos, Ms. Jamil Jones, please proceed to the stage. Everyone, please welcome.
Konnichiwa. We are so happy to be here with you in Japan. We love Japan, and this is our second time visiting. Thank you so much for attending this presentation with us, and we hope to tell you a little bit more about our school at High Tech High. So High Tech High is a group of 16 kinder through 12th grade project-based learning charter schools in San Diego, California. At High Tech High, we teachers design our own projects with our own students in mind. Through projects, students learn through an ongoing process of critical thinking, collaboration, ideation, creation, exhibition, and reflection. We do this work by way of 4 design principles. Equity, where we make sure our school population is diverse and reflective of the communities we serve. We also do this work through personalization, where we allow students to pursue their passions through projects and practice a learner-centered, inclusive approach. We are able to do this through small school size, small class size, home visits, advisories, and student collaborative work. We do this through authentic work, where our projects lead students through the creation of meaningful and beautiful work that matters to them, to their teachers, and the world outside of school. We do this through fieldwork, community service, internships, and fieldwork, and consultation with outside experts. And just to clarify, fieldwork is similar to field trips. Collaborative design. For collaborative design, this is where teachers at High Tech High design curriculum and projects together with one another, but we also design our projects with our students. This design model allows for all of us to continue the learning process together and model for our students how exciting the learning process could be. My favorite part about being a teacher at High Tech High is that I'm able to be at the ground level with my students. I'm able to work with them every single day, discover their passions, see what they want to inquire about and investigate. And as their teacher, I'm able to create experiences and situations for them to really reach those personal goals that they have, so that by the time they leave my classroom, they feel excited about learning, they feel excited about all of the skills that they're building, and then they feel like they could really take over the world and do whatever they hope to do in life. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, John, and he will go ahead and introduce himself as well.
Konnichiwa. My name is John Santos, and as I'm introducing myself, I'm extremely happy to see one of my former students, Yuka Oka, who actually attended High Tech High in San Diego in, 2009? 2005 and 6, okay. And so as much as I hope to bring the perspective of a High Tech High teacher and describe the schools that we come from and the experience that we try to create for students, I think she's a great resource as well, because she's actually a student who's been part of our learning experiences at High Tech High. So I wanted to make sure that I embarrassed her and pointed her out to the entire audience. So I am so honored to have been brought here from San Diego and be able to come over here to Japan and join such an impressive group of education leaders, and I'm both honored and a little bit intimidated to be in the company of all these amazing people. And in the work that we do, I think what we look at is our communities and our economies are changing really, really rapidly. And when we look at our schools, something that's been problematic is that schools have really kind of held on to and maintained really traditional structures. And in a way, it puts our young students, at a disadvantage because their learning experiences and the skill sets that schools are imparting on them aren't keeping up with the change that's happening in their communities and in their societies, and for that matter, aren't equipping them for the economies that they leave school and go in to join. And so Jamel was able to describe our school and what our school looks like, and I hope to talk to you about why schools like ours exist. So in the United States, sorry, I feel like it's a bit loud. Am I in the wrong place? In the United States, we had private schools and we have public schools. In private schools, the students and their families paid tuition to attend the school, and they used that money to be able to create learning experiences for those students. And so with that money, they were able to kind of create the qualities that they thought were appropriate and relevant for rich learning experiences, right? And so we looked at the qualities of private schools where class sizes were small, learning experiences were relevant, and there was also an enormous degree of freedom and autonomy in private schools. The problem with private schools is that not everybody can afford to go to private schools. And so when you look at these massive communities like Japan or massive communities like the United States, there's an inequity in learning experiences happening across the country because ultimately just people that have access to wealth then have access to education. And when you have access to that education, you have access to certain life positions beyond that educational experience. And that, to me, doesn't seem fair. When you looked at the design principles of High-Tech High, one of those huge ones was equity, right? Our public schools were funded by the state. And so we pay tax dollars. The tax dollars accumulate and are distributed to schools. And the schools do the best they can with the budget they can to create learning experiences, free learning experiences for the public, for taxpayers' children. The problem with that is there's inequitable distribution of money to schools, and even when it does get there, we found that there wasn't enough. Talking about budget and materials and the amount of, money and resources that go into public schools is one thing, but I'm more here to talk about autonomy and freedom. Because I would argue that autonomy and freedom and choice are just as powerful in terms of creating meaningful and deep and rich learning experiences as budgeting in itself. And so there was this huge disparity between the learning experience at a private school and a learning experience at a public school. And this is how schools like ours, which are considered charter schools, were born, where we wanted to create a learning experience that looked a lot like a private school learning experience, where class sizes were small. There was a lot of freedom for the teacher to kind of design learning experiences and curriculum that they felt was appropriate and enriching for that student and would set them up to have an advantage beyond high school or in their learning experiences. And so we wanted that, but we also, the challenge being, we didn't want to charge our students to go to these schools. And so the charter movement was born. How does that work? Students that attend our school come to our schools for free. And so the state is able to give us some money, but ultimately not enough money for all the types of programs that we want. And so we have to solicit a little bit of external money to be able to fund the programs. But what that allows us to do, since the state ultimately doesn't determine our curriculum, is it allows us the freedom to be able to design a curriculum that we feel is appropriate for our students. So Jamel put something up on the board earlier. Oh, sorry. I don't really pay attention to the slides. I'll touch on that one in a moment here. There's a great saying, and it says, people that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And when you've got the state of California or something, these kind of external agencies designing and imposing what an educational experience should look like that are far, far, far well removed from the learning experience, what we found is that the learning experience ultimately wasn't, I guess, appropriately designed for our students. And so in being a charter school, we aren't able to gain the types of resources and money from the state that a public school might be able to gain. But what it allows us is freedom, and freedom of choice and autonomy. And so the teacher is the designer ultimately. And those of us that are in the classroom with our students day to day with those learning experiences, we're the ones that are able to design meaningful learning experiences. And we're the ones that are closest to it and can make those types of adjustments on the fly with our students because we know our students and we know our students well. And it doesn't just stop at the teachers. Inside the classroom, there's also a huge degree of choice for our students. And so that autonomy allows for that as well, to where we don't have to have prescriptive educational experiences where the state determines what learning should look like. They prescribe it to the teachers, and the teachers then impose it on groups of young people, right? And so this is why schools like ours exist. And so up on this slide here, whoa, are you my clicker or am I clicking? Who's clicking for me? Okay, there we go. Up on this slide here, it shows the shift that we're seeing in schools right now. And to the left, on the left column, you're gonna see qualities of schools that we're trying to move away from. This is the more traditional school, where you'll see there's kind of three categories. The shift in what we're seeing with students, the shift in what we're seeing in the teachers, and the shift in what we're seeing organizationally. And so this kind of shift in the classroom where students, instead of listening, are actively engaged. They're learning, instead of being shallow, moves towards deeper. Instead of just consuming information, they themselves are producing information. Instead of working in isolation, there's a huge emphasis towards collaboration. Instead of being dependent, there's a huge degree of autonomy, like we spoke to earlier. And then for us teachers, instead of being teacher-centered, where classrooms full of students sit and listen to us, it's very much student-centered, and we create work and design work with the student at the center of that learning experience. Instead of being presenters, we're facilitators. Instead of thinking convergently, there's very divergent thought processes going on. And then in the organizations we see, instead of being controlled, which is what I've been speaking to, there's a huge degree, there's a shift towards autonomy and freedom. Instead of there being complex sets of rules, there are more simple principles that Jamel kind of touched on earlier today, where personalization is happening in the classroom, equity is happening in the classroom, teacher as designer is happening in the classroom. Can we have the next slide? Oh, so there we are. The last thing that I was going to say is that, just to kind of tie it all together, is Jamel described who we are. I described why we are those things. And I guess we have a room full of people here, and change isn't going to happen by somebody creating some magic formula or some sort of magic set of directions as a prescription of, like, this is the thing you need to do. I'm not here to tell you how this is going to happen. It's actually more of a shift in the cultural and the philosophical and the pedagogical way that we think. And it happens when people like this come together and can have conversations around the people that are closest to the learning experience and closest to these students can get together and share their perspectives, share their experiences, share their thoughts on what's happening in classrooms and how they might make both small changes in the classroom and in their schools or larger ones. This is ultimately how change happens, and I'm very inspired to be able to look out at what is essentially a huge group of educational leaders and change agents, and I feel, once again, I'm so happy to be part of this. Thank you so much. So now we were going to open it up to some questions. I think Emmy was going to join us. But I don't think necessarily, Emmy may join us in a few minutes, but until she gets here, I think we can just open it up to some questions. Yes.
Thank you. It sounds like private schools might be doing a lot of the right things already, and public schools and charter schools are doing what they can in order to perhaps catch up or develop a lot of similar practices from private schools. Is that the case, or is there still more room in even private schools for new kinds of learning experiences?
So I tend to think, I think we're all trying to do the right thing, and then it comes down ultimately to resources, what you have at your disposal. And so the two things really that we talked about are, the two main predominant resources are money is a huge one. So money allows for access to all sorts of different learning experiences, like small classroom sizes, which results in personalization, actual physical materials that you can use for learning experiences that are a little bit more in-depth than just book learning and things like that. So there's that, and then there's autonomy and freedom. And so anytime the challenge with public schools is what they're trying to do is regulate and streamline a massive process. And they're so far away from so much of it that ultimately you can really only create kind of a homogenized application or a homogenized experience that they just apply to all schools. I guess it's the easiest way to approach it. And so I do truly believe that those of us that are in education aren't into it for, like, you know, some of us to do something nefarious and the wrong way to do it. It's a matter of what you have access to. And so private schools is just a really great example of a small, very small group of people that have access to those two resources, both. And then public school is well intended, but just lacking in those resources, or some. There are some phenomenal public schools. And if you look at why those might be phenomenal, a lot of times it's going to have to some degree to do with access to some sort of budget, or access, so you look at, you know, higher socioeconomic neighborhoods, they're going to have access to a little bit more. Or for that matter, access to some type of freedom or wiggle room and autonomy. And typically that's what translates. And so there are all these models, and it's a matter of, I guess, the charter school is just, we're a little bit closer to that. The area where we could stand to be freed up a little bit more would be with budget and money. So actually High Tech High works on a fairly constrained resources with regard to money. But I think pedagogically and philosophically, I think we are progressive in that way. And then our public schools probably have the most amount of catching up to do. And it's just because of, I mean, when you think about our public school system, and I imagine the public school system here, it's massive. It's really, really big.
And to add to that, I started at High Tech as a first-year teacher, and so to have that sense of autonomy in my classroom, it wasn't only that I had the freedom, it was more so that I had the responsibility to do excellent work with my students. It placed a level of respect on my role as the teacher, knowing that I was in charge of the pathway through their learning, instead of having to follow maybe something that was written in a book by someone who has never been in a classroom with kids, and specifically my own students. And so I felt a good sense of pressure and that responsibility to continue the learning process in a way that I've experienced it, but then to also be organic with my students and move with them, and also be transparent and really highlight all that it means to be a lifelong learner instead of just a learner in one specific moment in time. And so I think the charter schools, it's not that, like what John was saying, it's not that one is doing something right. I think it's just the idea of who a teacher could really be for the students in their classrooms.
Hi. How about in the green shirt?
Hi, thank you very much for introducing your school. It's very interesting and very fascinating. I'd love to learn more. One thing, I'm a Japanese, but I work in the United States, and one thing I'm increasingly learning about Japanese education, that there are very unique schools that have have been taking very interesting approaches, but oftentimes those schools are so sort of individualized, that when students are always graduate from those schools and go into other types of schools that are not that innovative or that are not accepting to different types of learning. And so I'm curious to hear how your students, when they graduate and go to other environment, and I would imagine it's not necessarily like high-tech high, like make college environment or working environment. It's probably different a little bit. So if you could share some stories of your students, how they are sort of progressing into the later learning experiences.
So that's something that's kind of constantly on our mind. There was a philosopher and a writer, John Dewey, that kind of his suggestion was that schools should be constantly looking at the community beyond high school and looking at the economy beyond high school and be overtly preparing their students for that type of experience. Interestingly, I think both here in Japan and the United States, the first experience that happens after high school is college. And so a lot of us kind of fall into this rhythm of really most of the high school experience is preparing them for college or preparing them to be an applicant for college. And I think occasionally we overemphasize that experience and overemphasize the preparation for that experience, and it can be a bit blinding. And that's ultimately what students do, is simply prepare for college, which can, to a degree, set students up for success in college. You know, if they're used to the idea of, reading through textbooks to get information and regurgitating that on tests, I mean, there's a certain degree of preparation and benefit that comes from that and allows them to be successful immediately at college. But what we find beyond that is that when those students then enter into the workforce or enter into society, is that ultimately they're not super prepared for that, and they fall short when it comes to these skill sets like collaboration, communication, intense problem solving, and kind of navigating how they might be more innovative. These skill sets that don't really fall in that category of kind of college prep. So it's constantly on our mind as well, and I think it always should be. Somebody who's an educator and somebody who's working with students, you should be thinking of what is it that I'm trying ultimately to prepare this student for. I like to think of it more holistically in terms of preparing them for life. And so considering what types of qualities, if this student were to leave this experience, what types of qualities are going to benefit them beyond this? So again, it goes back to those kind of catchy words like collaboration and, an ability to think deeply. And those are incredibly valuable skill sets. To answer specifically your question, I think when our students get into at the university level, there's two things that happen. I think our students are a bit selective as to where they're going to go to university beyond high-tech high, and they're a bit intentional about trying to choose a school that might look a little bit more like ours because they themselves think that it's a kind of a more meaningful learning experience. So that's one, is they're selective about that. But initially, I think that there's a massive adjustment period where they are kind of like, this is different from the way that I'm used to learning. But what happens is in the long run, and so data, it is great to use data for these types of conversations. Our students, high-tech high students, actually end up staying in college and graduating from college with greater percentages than the typical high school student like myself, where I went to a high school that was really aimed and oriented towards preparing me for the college experience. And I got to college and I did all right. It was still extremely challenging, but I really didn't know what to do with much of that. And I think our students are a little bit more adept at kind of navigating really the problem solving that is figuring out what college or how to get through college.
こんにちは。今まで質問が英語ができる方にご質問いただいてたと思うんですが、もちろん日本語でご質問いただいて全く問題ありませんので、ぜひ日本語でもご質問いただければと思います。
2人が生徒の学びに寄り添ったりとかファシリテートする上で一番大事にしていることについて教えていただければと思います。よろしくお願いします。
What is one thing that you're really paying attention when you're trying to value students' opinion and try to be their coach as opposed or facilitator as opposed to being a direct instruction-based teacher?
For me, I think the biggest thing is that we're constantly thinking about and designing the learning experiences and redesigning those. At High Tech High, what is I think unique is that we have not designed one curriculum that then ultimately becomes a fixed learning experience that we repeat with our students. We're constantly making those types of adjustments. And the adjustments and changes that we make to those learning experiences are enormously influenced by our students. And that's not to say that when students come to our classes and express certain, that they want to do this, A, B, or C experience, that we can make those immediate changes to the learning experience. But as teachers and as facilitators of learning, I think we're constantly influenced by students, and because our class size is small, because there's that intimacy, because there's that personalization that our schools allow us to have with our students, and that personal relationship, we're able to get to know our students really well. We're able to find out more about them and find out more about, what learning experiences work well for them, and then kind of craft and make adjustments to both our designs and our plans, but then also in the immediate to kind of support all of our learners a little bit more.
And so I teach first grade, and I feel like it is very important for me to, when students come to me with ideas, they're looking to me to guide them. And so I try my best to stop and not give them my first thought or my first idea about how to move forward, because I really want to empower them, and I hope that they can see that they actually have their own ideas. And so what that might look like in my classroom is a student might come up to me and say, I'm really interested in learning about starfish. And then I ask them, okay, so, that's great. So how do you think, what's your first idea? Like, how are you going to find out about starfish? What do you think we should do? And so I always try to turn, if they ask me a question or give me a thought, I always try to put it back on them. And usually they say, oh, maybe we can go to the library and get some books about starfish, or maybe we can Google starfish. And I say, okay, we're not gonna just go to Google. But I try to really engage them, and so that they see it's not just me with all of the answers. They ask me questions, and I love to say, I don't know. For students to hear an adult say that they do not know, it's so powerful. And we end up engaging in the learning process together, and then they feel like, wow, I'm in first grade and I'm learning how to do this thing and that thing and this and that. And if I know it now at this age, if I know how to do these things at this age, then as I grow, I'll just continue to keep learning how to do those things. And so as the facilitator and the designer, that's the tricky part, because when do you know when to actually just move forward and give them that concrete instruction because they need it, and when do you open it up for the students to really guide that? And I find that when I have a concrete plan in mind, I'm more at ease to go with the students. If I don't have a concrete plan in mind, and it feels like, and when I say plan, I mean the activities, the lessons, the things that I plan on doing for a month or 6-week period. If I don't have that fully detailed, then I feel more like I just need to take control of the situation. But when I have a plan in mind, I feel more at ease to just move with them based on where they are in that moment.
I have one question. So just curious, based off of what you just said, right? How would you build an environment, prepare an environment so that kids are empowered to speak up their mind? Can we go to library and things like that? Because they oftentimes at Japanese schools, students are not necessarily empowered to voice such opinions because they're afraid. How do you create such a safe environment at High Tech High?
I think that's what's interesting about our schools, especially when people come to visit. They experience such a snapshot and just one kind of a really quick, brief image of what we are. And I think it's easy to feel inclined to think that that just happens through some sort of activity or some sort of learning experience that then results in kids feeling comfortable to have those types of conversations with teachers. But really, it's something that's built. Culture isn't something that happens, overnight. It really starts with teachers like Jamel when students are 4 and 5 and 6 years old, and the learning experiences are ones that, where the students are asked to talk to each other. Students are asked to share their voice and perspectives by way of, presentations or by way of exhibiting their work. And so it's not that because, we don't teach them necessarily how to do it. We create opportunities where their voice is valued and their voice is, they're put on stage and asked to kind of speak to their learning experience. And through years and years and years, their voice, their perspective, and kind of that confidence, it emerges because of those types of experiences.
Yes, I agree totally. In our schools, we do a lot of circles or morning meetings where students come in and they're not sitting at desks right away. We're just sitting on a carpet in a circle, and we're able to connect with one another and ask each other questions. And we want to be clear, we don't start right away, first day of school, engaging in this work. We have to model it, and we usually model it with low stakes conversations. So we might ask, what's your favorite place? What's your favorite food? Where do you like to go? All of these things where students feel comfortable sharing information in a safe setting. And so that's how we start to build that culture. And then as students get used to speaking with one another, as they get used to disagreeing with the teacher and having different viewpoints, all over what we would call silly things, then we start to raise the stakes, and we start to talk about things that are more substantial.
Thank you. ご質問、はい、どうぞ。
小学生の時からクロスディスプリンの教科横断的な学習をするのか、それとも本当に読み書きで、あと数学の基礎的な計算の方法とか、そういうのはちゃんと数学とか英語とかっていう教科ごとにやっぱり教科に分かれて1年生の時からやるのか、もしやるとしたらどの段階から教科横断型のプロジェクトベースドラーニングを始めるのかっていうのをお伺いしたいです。あと外国語を教える時、例えばスペイン語とか、そういう時にどんなふうにいつ頃からどんなふうに始めるのかっていうのもお伺いできたらありがたいです。お願いします。
So in elementary school, we teach all of the subjects, and that starts in kinder. So from kinder to 5th grade, those teachers are teaching reading, writing, math, and all of the other ones. And then we usually have 3 extracurricular teachers, or we call them exploratory teachers. So for instance, last year we had a science teacher, an engineering teacher, and an art teacher. And so students are getting access to those subjects. And then when they get to middle and high school?
Once they get to middle and high school, they're basically lumped into 3 different areas of sciences, humanities, and math. And I would think it's a bit of a spectrum. So as much as we're covering most of the subjects from an early age on, I think that the lines become a little bit more blurred towards high school, and a little bit more in-depth integration can happen. And so, but when you look at young learners, I think integration, true and deep integration, can be a little bit more challenging, and I think it is a little bit more of an appropriate time in their life to actually deliver a little bit more content. And so it's not this one-size-fits-all application of project-based learning happens like this, and it happens to all kids across the entire spectrum of 5 years old to 18 years old. To know the students and know, that their stages of development, know that it's a little bit more about social emotional development and identity work when they're younger, and it's a little bit, but then also that's a really appropriate time to kind of acquire all these content tools and little teeny, they can learn things like spelling and reading that ultimately get used as tools a little bit down the line, towards my end of things where I'm an 11th grade, biology teacher. So I would say content happens a little bit more towards when they're younger, and then there's this synthesis, and ultimately we ask them to kind of use that later, and there's a little bit more integration. With regard to language, I think we do it wrong. I think we start teaching languages. We teach Spanish. Where we live, we're very close to the Mexican border, and so Spanish is really a prevalent language. But we start teaching it when kids are about 13, 14 years old. And I think those of us that understand the brain understand that language acquisition actually doesn't happen as well at those later stages. And I tend to believe that actually languages should get moved into the younger years, more towards K through 5, and that things like sociology and psychology should be pushed up into the high school when kids are starting to kind of, enter the world as young adults. And so that is a critique I have of our schools, is the placement. The reason it is because of a strong pressure that comes from at the university level, where those are credit requirements that students need to meet. And so we're kind of obligated to teach language in high school, but I wish we didn't.
And the nice thing about being teacher as designer and having that autonomy is John is exactly right, and I actually was able to invite parents who speak other languages into my classroom during the morning meeting times so that the students could get exposed to those different languages. And I didn't have to get approval from my director before I could get it started, because of the trust and the relationship. So these things that you're bringing up, and when we feel like something isn't right with our organization, we can test it out in our classrooms first, and we can kind of get data around how it's affecting our students, and then we're able to enact change that way. And I think that we're able to do it faster because we're able to just go ahead and experiment in our classrooms.
I have one question again, because now you just finished working with 50 or so educators. Until yesterday, they had a 3-day workshop to work with Japanese educators on how to implement PBL, project-based learning, in Japan. And this is their second time, so I'm just curious to know, John, you kept saying that there should be Japanese version of PBL, and there's been some discussions around it, I would imagine, with your students this past week. And are there certain ways that you see that this project-based learning could work quite well in Japan, like in certain directions, or do you have some impression on that?
Absolutely. And so, again, it kind of goes back to that shift that's happening. I don't think it's necessarily this one fixed model. It's more of just thinking about being able to be intimately connected and understand our students well enough, and having the freedom to be able to craft a learning experience that we know is going to benefit them. And so I think that translates, it's cross-cultural, and so it's going to happen anywhere. It's really that most of us as educators, there are certain specific barriers that prevent us from ultimately doing one of two things: knowing our students well enough, so when you have 40 kids in your classroom, it's practically impossible to get to know them, because the management that is required to educate 40 kids, ultimately you're going to need to sit them in organized rows, and you're going to need to have them be quiet, and you're going to need to have them listen to you, just because of the amount of information that you need to get through in order to, I guess, educate them. And so it's a really, really structural thing. But if you changed that, whether it's in Japan or whether it's in the United States, and had a group of students that were closer to 18 students, closer to 20 students, closer to 24 students, I think any teacher with that, when you remove that type of barrier. And then the second, though, is a cultural shift. And I think that is something, we just worked with a group of, like you said, 50, 60 teachers. And I think that it was really refreshing to meet those teachers and see that I don't think that there's too much resistance from the teachers that they themselves don't want to change. And change is scary. We should all accept that making changes in our work and in our profession, and changing from something where it is a routine and it is comfortable, and changing away from that and trying something new is really scary. But with that said, the people that we were working with seemed really enthusiastic and excited about this whole idea of having the opportunity to actually create experiences that they know are going to, make for a more rich learning experiences for the students. Some of those teachers are here today. It's really cool to see them all.
I think I would say that, yes, of course, PBL could be designed specifically for your own culture. I think the first step is knowing that you already have a lot of, just coming to this presentation means that you're already thinking about ways that you can change. And I think that if I were to say anything, I would say to trust that feeling, try things in your classroom, allow to be vulnerable. One thing that came up in our workshop was that if you ask someone else, another colleague, for help, then that's the quickest way to get a team together, and then it starts to expand. And so you might say, I'm thinking about trying this new thing in my classroom, but I need your help. Can you come in and watch me or help me or co-teach this lesson with me, where I'm trying to have my students talk to one another? Simple things like that, and then it's amazing the way that it'll grow. It'll start to get people's attention. And so we don't want you to feel that everything that we're doing, it has to be that way. It's the way that whatever feels right to you. I think that's the first starting place. And then we are always available with any questions that you have, or if you want resources, we can give those to you. We hope to be lifelong colleagues in this work that we're doing, so please reach out to us, and we can support you along the way if that's what you're interested in, for sure.
So while in Japan we're in a transitional kind of time to new types of education, I think that's why everyone's here today thinking about, it's the new future of education, right? What are the things outside of the school, parents and other adults in society, what are the roles that they can play to help progress in this process? Do you have some tips on that?
The first thing that kind of comes to mind for me is that we keep using this word integration. And so when we look at integration, we're typically talking about or thinking about how we can integrate subjects, or how we can integrate students from different walks of life within a classroom. But when we think about integration, a lot of times it's really integrating our students into their own community. And so for so long, education has happened in its own bubble. And you live a life, and then you go to school. And you have a learning experience at school, and then you go have your life experience outside of school. And the two have really not been well integrated over the years. And so I think when you look at professionals in the community, when you look at parents in the community, I think the best thing that you can do is be open to this idea of integration, is that how can parents not necessarily participate, but be an audience to the learning that is happening with their students? How can parents be supportive of, I guess, bringing real world experiences into the classroom and bringing the classroom out, bringing kids out of their classroom and learning environment there into the real world. And so that would be my biggest suggestion to the people that aren't necessarily the teachers in the classroom, is to think about how you might partner with education, so that type of integrated experience can happen.
We have, so our schools, we do not have a busing system. So all of our field works, or anything where we have to leave the classroom, we have no buses. And so we actually rely on the parents to be our drivers. And that is one of the biggest ways, I think, where parents are realizing how much we need them. A lot of the most exciting work happens outside of the classroom, when kids get to actually be hands-on at the location, front and center. And so the parents know. Testing. Oh, I think it. So the parents know right away that we need them. And then it's the same thing with the community. We create things for the community, and so we'll go to museums, we'll go to libraries, and we'll say, our students, we build things, so what do you need? And then they give us ideas, or they say, we want this to be created for kids, by kids, and we go, great, we'll go back, like, let's partner together and let's integrate together. And a lot of times I've had to ask parents to be the expert because maybe they work in the field of what we're studying. And so we have those parents come in, and it's easier that way if I don't really know where to start. I usually start with the parents of my students or previous parents. So there's plenty of ways to integrate beyond the classroom. And once again, it's asking for help, and it's sending an email to all of the parents or community members that you know, and you'd be very surprised at how much you get back for the sake of the children.
Thank you. あと2問ぐらい。じゃあ後ろの方からまず最初にお願いします。眼鏡をかけてる男性の方。
お話ありがとうございます。自由度が高いっていうのはすごい素晴らしいなと思う一方で、結構何かをこう選択することって重要だと思うんですけども、少人数っていうのは結構日本でもやってることだと思うんですけども、他の学校と比べて違うところとか、あと具体的にどのようなことを大事にしてどのようなことをしているのかっていうのを例であったらお願いします。
I think the biggest difference that comes to mind immediately, that is a concrete example, is the exhibition of student learning. And so for so many of us, our learning experiences, our students, we're actually similar in that way, where there's a teacher kind of managing a learning experience, and there's, the teachers put forth some sort of, work or a project or some sort of learning experience in motion. But a lot of times when I was in school, I was asked to write papers, I was asked to create work, but ultimately I handed it in to my teachers, and they gave me points or they gave me grades, and then they threw it in a trash can. And when you do that for years and years and years, you experience such diminishing enthusiasm around creating work. And so that's what's happening in so many of our schools, and so much of our learning experience has been really pouring yourself into a learning experience and trying hard and wanting to do well and creating something that you're proud of, and having somebody throw it in a trash can. And so the biggest shift that we've experienced at our schools is that at the end of our learning experiences, and constantly within the learning experience, there's this shift towards exhibiting student work. And so when our students create something, it's with this understanding that at the end of this learning experience, you're going to show it to somebody. And when you do that, it really emphasizes that their work and their learning and that process all matters, and it really elevates kind of the engagement and motivation of a student. There's this guy, Ron Berger, who I absolutely recommend checking out, and he kind of created this hierarchy of audience. And when you think at the very low end of that hierarchy of audience, we have the teacher. The teacher is ultimately the first audience, right? They design work, you create work, you give it to the teacher, and they're an audience. But for most of us and most of our learning, that's where it ends, and they are the only audience to our work. But if you think about it, it goes to the parents, it goes to potentially the community, and ultimately the highest form of audience is ultimately creating something that's of service to the world. And I think that that's a pretty ambitious goal, is to create work that is of service to the world. But the thing that sets us apart is that we exhibit student work, and that's actually something that all of us can do pretty quickly and pretty easily. There's not much of a massive shift that needs to take place in our classrooms. Is just think of how at the end of some sort of learning experience, the students can show that work. Can they show it to another group of students? Can they show it to the community? How can they do that? And it absolutely creates a massive shift in kind of that motivation, the engagement. And just like I was talking about, years and years and years of throwing away student work can have diminishing impact on an enthusiasm for learning. It's the opposite. When you look at years and years and years of learning experiences where the work is celebrated and ultimately shared with an audience, I think students become more and more and more engaged in the work and learning.
And we hope that work lives on at school or in the communities. So even after the exhibition, we talk a lot about curation, and that's just a fancy word for saying that the work is living on in the schools so that other students can see the high quality work that their peers are creating.
じゃあちょっと時間になったので最後に1問で、明日も先生方のパネルございますので、よかったらじゃあ、左側の方を一人、はい。
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I would like to ask you about like interpersonal skills. I work as a leadership and development in business area, and then offering like those soft skills courses like conflict management or problem solving skills. But it's so late to start learning in when we grow up. So if you have any like a highly focused soft skills during your school period, I would like to know.
It starts with you.
Yeah, okay. So at the first grade level, that's pretty much most of my day is focusing on soft skills and helping students problem solve independently. What I do though is with the morning meetings and with certain moments throughout my day, I'm specifically focused on that. And it was hard for me in the beginning because maybe I was asking students to do content, academic content, like reading, writing, or math. So it was hard for me to shift and say, okay, I know that my students should be reading right now, but I'm not actually going to assess their reading. I'm actually looking at how they're sharing the book, how they're engaging in conversation, how they're doing all those things. So throughout the day, I intentionally plan to look into those soft skills, and then we talk a lot about those soft skills, and we might do it one-on-one, where it's student and teacher and we're having that conversation together, or in small groups if I find that a small group of my students are needing help with that specific skill. But then since we are designers, I might design a project experience. Maybe it's a mini project, not a full-on 3-month project, but a mini project where we're focusing on why those soft skills are important.
And so that's a great question. And more, I consider them, I don't even consider them soft skills, I consider them essential skills. And so I think things that can help with the development of those types of skill sets are, collaborative learning, where you're creating these projects and these learning experiences that have these end goals, but you're asking students to work together. And just the process of kind of organizing those types of groups, and where there are, students from very different walks of life, from very different socioeconomic, racial, gender backgrounds that come together to kind of create work together. I think that helps in the development of those skill sets that you're talking about. But another one is reflection. And so there's this constant emphasis on the power and kind of growth that happens through reflecting on a process. And so you have years and years and years of these learning experiences happening. And ideally, there are going to be some successes within that, but there's also going to be massive mistakes. And we're very celebratory of mistake making, because I think all of us in this audience recognize that huge opportunities for growth really come from some of the big mistakes that we make. And so we're constantly asking our students to reflect on the process in itself. And in doing so, they themselves are able to say, like, this is what I did, this is what I do differently. And they kind of develop a comfort around a culture of, reflection and understanding how you might do things differently. And you, who's coming from business, I think recognizes the value in people that can actually be a little bit more comfortable around this idea of, trying new things, making mistakes, being reflective, but, obviously working to improve, right?
Thank you very much. すいません、まだまだご質問あると思うんですが、ちょっと今日はお時間が来てしまいましたので、明日また、2人の先生と4人のパネルをさせていただきますので、もし明日もご来場の方はぜひぜひご質問を持っていらっしゃってください。どうもありがとうございました。Thank you very much, Sean and Jamel.